Okay, so today we have artist Paul Gauguin, whose work is currently being exhibited at the Young in San Francisco. It's, I think, one of California's first major exhibitions of Paul Gauguin's work. Recently, there was a big exhibition of his stuff at the Tate, which I think is in London, and it was really popular. And I think one of the reasons that it attracted so much attention is because Paul Gauguin, historically, is a very controversial figure. So we're going to look at his work today and figure out what it was that makes him such a tricky guy. So 1848. Do you guys know anything about this time in history, somewhere between 1848 and 1903, what was going on in the world?
Um,
Just historically?
I'm trying to think. Movements. Was it war pops into mind?
War, right. Civil War.
It's always war. It's a civil war.
The American Civil War.
There we go.
In 1849, they discovered gold in California, which was a brand new state. And during Paul Gauguin's lifetime, in Europe, they were going through the Industrial Revolution. And they were also experiencing what was known as the Second Imperial, what do they call it? New imperialism. Mm-hmm. So a lot of countries in Europe were expanding and colonializing different places around the world. And at this point, when Paul Gauguin was in his late teens, maybe early 20s, most of Europe was battling to take claim of different countries in Africa. France had invested a lot of its energy colonializing parts of the Pacific and other places, of course. And Tahiti, when Paul Gauguin was young, probably just a couple years before he was born, Tahiti was colonized by France. So let's just kind of put a pin in that and keep in mind that when Paul Gauguin was a child, cameras were brand new. They had just been invented. Railroads were brand new and were just now being expanded. And the world was an imperial world of white men reigning over, other countries. Does that make sense?
Yes. It's all coming back to me now.
Okay. This is what he looked like. According to his biography, Paul Gauguin was born on June 7th, and his parents were Clovis and Aileen. Aileen's mother, his grandmother, was half Peruvian, which would make Aileen a quarter Peruvian, and that would make Gauguin an eighth. So if you're an eighth of anything, it's very little. It's kind of minor. Mm-hmm. But during his lifetime, Gauguin tried to make that bigger than it was. It was part of the character he developed for himself, that he was a little bit more exotic than your average Frenchman because he has Peruvian blood.
Right.
He played that up quite a bit. So when he was little, he and his family were forced to move from France to Peru to live with family members because things were a little bit tough in France. There was a revolution going on, well, not the French Revolution, but King Louis Napoleon was kind of creating a political problem for his parents. So they got on a ship and left for Peru, where Dad, Clovis, died of a stroke all of a sudden. So when Gauguin was only 2 years old, he lost his father. Mom and his sibling Marie and the three of them spent some time in Peru living with the uncle, who was actually very wealthy and connected in some way to the presidency of Peru. I think it was his son-in-law that was running the country. So Gauguin's early life was spent wealthy. He was well cared for. He was sent to really high-end boarding schools, and he suffered for nothing except for the loss of a father. He enrolled in a seminary school in Chapelle-Saint-Mesmin. It was a first-rate boarding school. He was given a good education, but they were forced again to move. They moved back to Paris when he was about 12 years old, and he lived there with his mother and sister until adulthood. Let's take a look at his family. When he was about 25 years old, Gauguin married this Danish woman, Mette Gad, and they had 5 children. Emile, Aileen, Clovis, Jean-René, and Paul. Paul became a stockbroker where he made a ton of money. Speculating, I think, is the word we want. He did a lot of speculating, and the stock market was really healthy at this moment in time. So he was working for a bank, and this came after he spent his teenage years working in the merchant marine and doing his stint in the Navy, because at this point, when you were a French citizen, you had to serve in the military. You were required to serve for a period of time. So he'd already seen the world a little bit. He joined the merchant marine when he was only 17. And then the Navy a little bit later. He came back a first officer. So he had been around, and he'd explored the islands of the Pacific. He'd seen Australia. So by the time he settled down with Mete, he already had a taste of adventure. He'd already sown his wild oats a little bit. So it seemed like a pretty good time for a guy like Gauguin to settle down and take care of his family and make a lot of money. As a matter of fact, at this point in the game, he was making about $120,000 a year. That's today's money. I don't know what the number was then, but he was making very decent money and was doing really well. Unfortunately, the stock market crashed. And I really don't know how long it lasted, but it was bad enough for Paul that he lost his job. And he decided at this moment in time that he was going to invest his time and energy into becoming an artist. It had already been sort of a side gig for him. He had been a collector. And he bought and owned the artwork of Impressionist artists like Degas. And he bought a bunch of Cezanne paintings. So he had all this stuff in his house, really important Impressionist works. So when he lost his job, he had to sell a lot of those paintings to pay the bills. This is one of his early masterpieces. These women are experiencing a sermon, or after a sermon, they're watching Jacob wrestling with an angel. And this piece was kind of a coming out piece for Paul Gauguin. Did you see this in art history?
I don't remember, to be honest with you.
It's in our textbook, but it's not one of the AP required pieces. This is an artwork that Gauguin would have shown to his collaborators, his partners in crime, his friends who were all Impressionist artists. He actually exhibited with the Impressionists from the 5th exhibit all the way until I think it was their 8th exhibit. He showed for 3 different times. He showed with them. So he kind of considered himself to be an Impressionist. But does that look like Impressionism to you guys?
Not quite. No. There's a lot missing if you were to compare it to the other Impressionists that we studied.
Seems plain, or the color, the orange, I don't know really goes well with the rest of it, or the mood at least.
So you think the orange makes it stand out as different from something that an Impressionist artist would do?
For some reason, when I think of Impressionists, I think of a lot of, because Impressionists, they're basically taking their impression of what they've seen in the world and putting their own impression onto a piece of paper or canvas. This doesn't quite feel that way, because this doesn't feel so much like an experience, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, you're right. The Impressionists made it their priority to capture the effects of light on color and on shapes they saw in natural landscapes. They painted en plein air. But what Gauguin's doing here is he's making something up.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't look real.
It could be considered maybe an impression of something he imagined, but that doesn't quite follow what the Impressionists believe in.
Yeah. And so his friend Pissarro, who was the leader of the Impressionist group, had a fight with Gauguin over this painting because it was supposed to be part of their Impressionist exhibit, but it breaks all the Impressionist rules.
Right.
It's not studying the effects of the sunlight. It's basically showing an expressive use of color and in a flat, decorative motif, and he's outlined things. Now, the Impressionist artists never left lines around their objects. So Gauguin kind of felt himself to be sort of an outsider among the Impressionists. So today, when we look at Gauguin in art history books, he's classified as a post-Impressionist because he's taking a lot of what they did, but he's breaking enough rules now where Pissarro's like, okay, you can't be part of our club anymore. This painting was the one that really broke the camel's back for Pissarro. You haven't created something real that we can see. It's not realism, which is at the heart what the Impressionists really were. They were realists. This is an act of imagination. And that became sort of Gauguin's calling card for the rest of his career. I think he took that and he decided, well, you're right. I like to use my imagination. I like to be original. And he began to kind of identify himself more as a symbolist, adding very personal symbols into his work. This stuff that I'm showing you guys is from Brittany. This is the countryside of France where, according to Gauguin's mythology, people were living much more uncluttered, simple lives. So he's trying to portray an image that the women there are simple, that they're like Eve, that they're like the Virgin Mary, and he's posed them here around a crucifixion scene of Jesus that's kind of geographically out of place if you think about it, because Jesus was crucified in the Far East, and this is the not the same kind of landscape. Now the color would have offended the viewers.
Yes.
And Gauguin's paintings never sold in his lifetime. He had a very difficult time getting people to pay attention to his early work, and critics really hated his stuff. They hated that he would paint this pure yellow, that instead of green trees, we've got red trees. I mean, it was just way too forward thinking for them, way too modern. So he was a penniless artist and was really struggling to pay the bills and to take care of his family and to support them. This is the actual crucifix. It hangs inside a church in Pont-Aven, which is I think it's pronounced Pont-Aven. It is an artist community in Brittany in France, and this is a little cathedral there where this original Christ on the cross exists. So looking at this piece and comparing it to his painting, you would think that, wow, he really does kind of steal stuff and incorporate it into his work. Symbols that he really has very little to do with, because he wasn't a practicing Catholic and probably had very little interest in telling the real story about Christ's crucifixion.
Right.
He was proud of that piece. He was proud of himself. I guess you could kind of describe him as a narcissist. And this is a self-portrait he did that he shared with a couple of his friends, other post-impressionist artists that he hung out with, like Vincent van Gogh and Emile Bernard. The three of them had sort of a bromance going on. They were really tight. And they did this fun thing. I would love to do this with fellow artists. I think this is a really unique idea. Vincent started it, and he painted a self-portrait, and he mailed it to Gauguin. And then Gauguin did a self-portrait, and he mailed it to Emile Bernard, and Emile Bernard did a self-portrait and sent it to Vincent. So all three of them had this kind of swap and trade kind of relationship. And you'd think that they would be best of buds. So they started to talk about putting together an artist colony that's not in Pont-Aven, but maybe somewhere in southern France. They wanted an artist colony of the South. And Vincent was really excited about that. He thought it would be a great way for them to build up each other and to support one another and to exchange ideas. And that's not exactly how it turned out. At this point, Gauguin is pretty penniless. His relationship to Vincent is one you might suggest was actually pretty manipulative. We want to think that Gauguin was a really good friend, but he wasn't. He was actually using Vincent because his brother Theo was an art dealer, and he was kind of hoping that he could get in with him and that Theo would do his best to sell his work. Eventually, Theo does agree to support Paul, and he offers to pay not only his rent, but kind of a monthly stipend to get Paul to live with Vincent in the little yellow house down in Arles. When he arrives there, he does some paintings with Vincent, and for about 9 weeks, they get along really well. They started their little commune in this little yellow house, and this is the pool hall, the little cafe that was attached to their home, showing some, locals kind of enjoying absinthe and smoking and hanging out in a very, Paul Gauguin sort of style. We can recognize the flat use of color and the kind of discordant complementary tones and the thick outlines.
The warmth.
Yeah. And he's beginning to develop a style he wants to call primitivism, but he's not quite there yet. He's been investigating primitivism. Right now, what we do to name this work is we call it cloisonnism. Cloisonné is an old jewelry making process where they would use gold, and then they would fill the recesses of a gold piece with enamel. They used to do that way back in the medieval period. And because we've got these thick outlines around the objects, art historians define this art style as being like Cloisonnism. It was a response to pointillism. Do you guys remember Seurat?
Yeah, he did that giant piece of the people in the park, right?
The one that's made out of nothing but dots?
Yes.
Seurat was actually a collaborator and a friend of Gauguin's. And for a while, when Gauguin first started painting, he painted everything with tiny dots. But then as he matured and began to rebel, he decided to outline everything and to try to really break himself away from the Impressionists. He created this style. What I like about this piece is how closely it relates to Van Gogh's piece, the famous Night Cafe. I'm more of a Van Gogh fan, so what I knew about Gauguin originally was all connected with him. So Theo has decided to pay Gauguin an allowance to live with Vincent van Gogh. And the reason he wants that is because Vincent is suffering at this point from being bipolar and being epileptic and being addicted to absinthe. And he's a sickly person who can't hold down a job, can't really take care of himself. So Theo was hoping that it would be Gauguin's job to kind of watch over him. But that's not the way it turned out. The two of them fought terribly near the end. And it started in December. It turns out that when the weather is cold and rainy or even snowy, you can't go outside to paint. And these two artists were stuck in a small house together day after day in the cold, and they would fight about paint. They would fight about detail. They would fight about process. And one of the things they had that was so different was that Vincent only painted what he could see, and Gauguin made stuff up. And the two of them believed that they were right. And they would fight about it. They actually fought about it so severely that one night on December 23rd, 1889, Vincent threatened Paul Gauguin with a straight razor. And Paul Gauguin left the house. It was that night that history tells us Van Gogh cut off part of his ear. He then took that piece and he went to the cafe where that pool table is, and he handed it to a bartender who was also a prostitute. They called the police because he was bleeding like crazy, and he was taken care of by paramedics. And the officers did wonder, where's your roommate? And there was a question like early on where they asked, yeah, did Paul Gauguin do this to you? Mm-hmm. And he never uttered a word. Vincent never said a word about it. He wrote in letters to his family that he had cut his ear himself. And a lot of people have always assumed that he did because, he had a moment of madness. It was, like cutting, it was self-injury. But guess what? There is a new theory. I don't believe it personally, but a book has just been released where people are theorizing that Paul Gauguin actually cut Vincent's ear with a sword.
Oh,
Whoa. Okay.
where'd the sword come from?
Apparently, Paul was a trained fencer, and it was one of his favorite pastimes. And he had a sword and a fencing mask and a hilt that he kept his saber in. And when he left for Paris right after this night was over, he took off and he went straight back to Paris. Vincent wrote a letter to his brother Theo saying, Paul has requested that I return his mask and saber or something like that. He mentions it in a letter. And then in another letter that he writes a year later to Paul Gauguin, because they actually did continue to write one another, he mentions to him, "You have been quiet and so will I," which these new researchers believe was a pact that they formed between them to keep it a secret that Paul had attacked him.
It's not a crazy idea.
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence there.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I would, if I were a person who just heard this like word of mouth, I would probably believe it.
Yeah.
But we won't know for sure until time travel's invented.
Yeah, right. The thing is, there's no bloody sword, so we don't have any evidence. According to the theorists, when Paul left the house, he threw the sword into the river. And then Vincent, according to this theorist, it gets even funnier. They think that Vincent protected him all these years because he had a crush on him. And I'm like, oh,
I mean,
Scandal.
I don't know about that. I know that Vincent had trouble with romantic relationships, but he was always madly in love with women. So I don't think that he was infatuated with Gauguin and trying to protect him that way. I think they were just brethren and fellow artists. And I still don't know exactly why he'd protect him if he did attack him with a sword. So that's something. So this is poor Vincent. This is a portrait he painted of himself. He sent this to his mother just to kind of let her know that he was doing fine. But he wasn't really doing fine. Vincent never recovered from that moment, whether or not it was just self-mutilation or an attack. He wound up in a series of asylums where he spent the last couple of years of his life before committing suicide.
There's that cute E poster behind him.
Japanese prince, very influential on the work of him and Paul Gauguin, actually. So Paul, a little disturbed by the fact that his roommate just, had this attack, this depressive attack, has decided to leave Paris for Tahiti. And this is the route I think he took. This is an incredibly long trip. It takes several months by ship to make it to Tahiti. He wanted to choose a place where he thought the people lived a very unspoiled, uncivilized life. Because, according to Gauguin, he was a savage, and only savages lived this kind of unspoiled existence of pleasure and of beauty. And it was a false impression. It was something that he adapted from stories that he'd heard about the French colonies. And his ideal was completely out of date. Perhaps the island had been like that once, but for the past 50 years or so, it had been colonized by the French and Christianized. So when he arrived in Tahiti, he didn't find naked women roaming the island, making love to anybody and, just eating fruit like they're in the Garden of Eden. He found a civilized colony that had been Catholicized, and the women were wearing white gowns. So he was right away a little disappointed in what he found. This is a couple of photographs that have both recently been discovered of what scientists think is Gauguin and a friend of his, along with a couple of their vahines, which is the word they use to describe French Polynesian women. There's something about these pictures that kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies.
You feel it too, right?
Yeah.
The woman in the left photo, she doesn't seem very happy. I understand that you couldn't really smile in these black and white photos, but I can't help but feel like she's really uncomfortable, and the way his hand is just draping over her.
And it's on her breast.
It doesn't feel good, for
No.
sure.
And, they're all kind of piled on top of each other in this picture, too. The look on his face feels very...
Unsettling.
Like he should be reported.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if any of this happened today, he would be reported.
For sure.
Yeah.
When he arrived in Tahiti, and this is part of his mythology, what he wrote in his journals, a story that he calls Noah Noah. It's a book that he published after he came back to Paris. He tells stories about how he arrived on the island and immediately meets like a chief and his wife, and they give him their daughter as an offering, their 13-year-old daughter named Puhura, who becomes his bride on that very day. And within the month, she's pregnant with his child. So I'm thinking, okay, Paul Gauguin is a pedophile.
Oh, yeah?
and kind of a creepy one at that. Let's take a look at some of the artwork that he made while he was in Tahiti. These are some of the paintings that are known as Gauguin's masterpieces. These are the Tahitian Women series, and there's a bunch of them. And they're built on fantasy, built on the fantasy of a white European man who I guess we can call exploitative at the very least. A person who is doing a great deal of cultural appropriation. And cultural appropriation in this respect is when a person in power begins to kind of adapt or absorb cultural elements from people that they're in control of and power of. Have you guys ever heard of cultural
Yes.
appropriation?
Yeah.
Oh,
yes, yeah.
So it's kind of
Mhm.
coming from the more powerful person.
Yeah. They're taking what's not theirs.
Taking
And
And
what's
calling
not
it their own,
Yeah.
not even like paying respect to
Right.
whatever it was inspired from.
No.
Not at
They're not giving any credit to the people that it belongs to.
Right.
They're taking it from themselves, and people usually from the outside thinks it's like some taboo, this new trend,
Mm-hmm.
when there's people doing it all along.
Like those T-shirts with those like with those Buddhist symbols.
Right.
Those bother me
Mhm.
because they're not even paying homage to the actual like ideas in religion. They
Yeah.
think, oh, it's pretty.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
wear it. Everyone else is wearing it. Doesn't
Mhm.
make it okay.
And I think a lot of Europeans in the 19th century were doing a great deal of cultural appropriation
Mhm.
because during this age of imperialism, all white European males thought themselves superior to the rest of the world because they were the imperial power. And so they assumed that these people in Tahiti, for example, they made a lot of assumptions. And Gauguin is probably one of the worst of the assumers.
Ouch.
He made the assumption that he was going to arrive and that there were going to be naked women, but there weren't. So whenever you look at one of these naked women, you have to remember that these are, first of all, they're not women, they're children.
Mhm.
This girl is 13 years old, and he has stripped her for this image. And talk about the male gaze, but he's also required that she take off her Catholic white dress that she's been given by the missionaries who have colonized her village. And he's incorporated imagery that he uses very, I guess, ambiguity would be the word for it. He's using these idols and figures as just stolen, appropriated imagery that he really doesn't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually weren't even genuine to the people of Tahiti. They were from ancient antiquity. They had very little to do with the people of Tahiti in 1891. So that's the start of what makes Gauguin a bit of what we call a reprehensible figure. And cultural appropriation in 1891 would not have been such a bad word. When we look at it now, we're looking at it through the lens of a 21st century viewer and as feminists.
Mhm.
But we have to remember that from where he was coming from, this was just his own mythology.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Would he have gotten away with it today?
Oh, no way. News coverage was different nowadays, like back then, and
Yeah.
nowadays, I mean, to most people, he's probably just a person next door, and they wouldn't have heard of everything he did.
Well, Gauguin was not a very well-liked guy even in his own time. I mean, we can cut him a lot of slack because of historic context, but think back to that wife and 5 children. Where have they been this whole time? He completely abandoned them. And in the meantime, you know what he did? He left them a few paintings to sell. But his artwork doesn't sell.
Right.
So
Oh
it's
my
like leaving them
God.
garbage. And the polite society that he had abandoned when he left Paris the first time around, they thought he was a reprehensible figure for doing that. They knew right away that you don't leave a wife and 5 children completely desolate. Now, if we get to the pedophilia bit, this is something I learned today that I found mind-blowingly baffling.
Mhm.
But in California, here in the United States, remember California was a brand new state, but we did have consensual laws in this country all over the place. Different states had different ages of consent.
Mhm.
Guess what the age of consent for sexual activity was in California in 1891?
Is it an alarmingly low number?
Yeah, it was
Oh.
10.
No.
Jesus.
It was
Oh,
10.
God.
So guys like Gauguin is probably thinking, so I've bedded a 13-year-old child, and not to mention 2 others who are 14. He's justified because in Paris at the time, the age of consent was 12.
Oh no.
Yeah, in certain states here in the United States, in Utah, it was 7.
Oh,
So
what do you say to that?
it's what makes looking at art difficult because you want to mute these men, these bad men who made beautiful things.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, people, they bring it up when they talk about Woody Allen, you know, who's a great filmmaker. And but then afterwards you're like, I can't watch that anymore. I can't watch Bill Cosby's routines anymore.
Right.
Um,
Love the art, hate the artist.
right. But can we still love the art if it's all myth?
That's the thing.
If it's all culturally appropriated lies, if it's all based on manipulation, and if these lies are just part of his fantasy. This is also part of his fantasy. This is the house he built for himself in the Marquesas, called the Maison du Jour, which I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but in English that translates to the house of pleasure, which other people translate to the house of orgasm.
Wow.
And he was, at this point, just a dirty old fart.
Seriously.
Yeah.
That's an understatement.
Right? These are some of the illustrations for the book he wrote called Noah Noah. And if I could put this in quotes, the word wrote is loose here because he actually plagiarized a great deal of the writing
Oh my God.
from a book that was written by a Dutch writer in 1903. So even the book Noah Noah that he published to publicize his collection was mostly stolen too. So even that is myth. Then his daughter, Aileen, she passed away. He hasn't seen her for 6 years, but when he last saw her, she was 13. She has died, and she was his favorite child, and he is heartbroken, and he hears the news several months after she's passed on. And he decides to create this final piece. This is the one that we study in AP Art History. Title I can never remember.
Where do we come from? Where are we? Where are we going?
There you go. And it's a myth about womanhood, where we come from. We're mothers, we're children, we're babies and infants. And then when we reach motherhood or adulthood, we get to pluck the fruit. I'm assuming the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. He's added in these appropriated idols, which weren't even really, Polynesian idols, but borrowed imagery. And then he ends with, and then you become old and you die. It's a very confusing piece, and art historians really don't have a true picture of what it means. But Gauguin wrote about it in his book Noah Noah, and in letters back to his friends, he said, I tried to kill myself after completing the work. He poisoned himself with arsenic. He wanted this to be his opus, his final masterpiece, his final statement about life. He called himself a feminist.
In what
Take
way?
it back.
He actually had a lot of feminist perspectives about, how women are made weak by the corsets, and he's really looking at it from a Western European perspective. Maybe he's a feminist while he's living in Paris, but he's definitely not a feminist while he's living in Tahiti and in the
He's
Marquesas.
tainted. He's tainted.
Well, his tainted stuff, although we may not like him anymore as a person, did have a great influence on art history. And this is a famous piece by Picasso that picks up some of the cues that Gauguin had left behind. But I want to pose the question to you guys as you think about Gauguin and his influence on art history. Outside of his current pieces that are selling, I'm sorry, not his current pieces. He's been dead for a long time. He died in 1903. He died twisted, bitter, angry, sick, and penniless in the Marquesas. As a matter of fact, he died of symptoms from an extended exposure with syphilis. So not only did he bring his kind of twisted racist perspective to the islands of Tahiti, he brought syphilis with him, and he gave it to all these young girls. He also left children behind on the island. A couple of these women had children for Gauguin, and their children are still thriving on the islands of Tahiti. Gauguin's memory is still kept there. There's a museum there. They still have his house. They have shrines. They celebrate Gauguin because he brought a great deal of tourism and continues to attract people to their islands. But I'm going to suggest that if he hadn't come around, we still would have gotten to where we were going, art history-wise. These are pictures by Emile Bernard, who was also a symbolist and a member of the Cloisonnism movement and was close friends with Vincent van Gogh and did a lot of the same kind of work, color-wise and experimentally. So, we might even be able to say that Gauguin's influence maybe, could have done without it, really.
Yeah.
Right.
For all you know, maybe he took that idea from him and made it his own.
He
Right.
did.
Very
They
nice,
collaborated. They picked up on each other's
Yeah.
stuff.
What I'm saying is maybe Gauguin isn't so original.
This
Mhm.
piece recently sold for almost $300 million. So he's still incredibly influential. And I guess people need to kind of come to some kind of rationalization on how they want to relate to him and to his work.
Mhm.
So that is Gauguin. You guys have any closing thoughts?
Why?
I mean, we could have done without.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.